Are you ready to become a change maker? Our 48-week postgraduate program in public policy or the PGP may be just the thing for you. This hybrid program is designed to give you both the theoretical foundation and hands-on experience needed to excel in policy making. With a mix of expert-led webinars, in-person workshops, and policy simulation exercises, you'll gain real-world skills along with personalized mentorship. Through our policy programs, we connect good people to good ideas and good networks. Apply now at the link in the description to make an impact.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
An unexpected space where storytelling exists is in community-led radio in communities across India. And today we want to talk about how such local communities endeavor to preserve civic engagement, local governance, democratic rights, and active citizenship. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. I'm Shreya, your host today, and I'm really excited for today's conversation on how local communities drive civic engagement. And joining me today is my colleague, Kripa. Hi, Kripa. Welcome.
Hi, Shreya. So excited to be here and looking forward to our discussion on this fascinating topic.
Hi. Yes, so I'm super excited too. I recently came across this article about an all-female community radio station called Sangam Radio, and I remember sharing it with you, and you'd already read that piece too. And I think we can agree that we both found it really inspiring and also like a very ingenious idea for a system to exist that enables civic engagement at such a hyper-local level and promotes local governance and citizenship in very participatory ways.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad that we had a chance to discuss it and landed on eventually making it a larger conversation, because I think the hook in some way for both of us was this idea also that storytelling featured amidst the list of different things that the community radio was doing. And, you know, the article that we were referencing was, and we'll get into it, I know, some examples of some of these media platforms and how these, you know, community networks operate. But what I thought was really cool that, you know, when some of the folks at this community station were talking about the value of such a network, one of the things that they talked about is they felt that their stories were not well represented by larger sort of media houses or journalists who would come, because usually we are speaking of these community spaces in more rural context.
Yeah.
That's the scope, I guess, of our discussion today. But it was really interesting that something fairly prominent that emerged was this idea that they felt that they were not well represented in mainstream media. And so that sort of became a part of the impetus, actually, to share their own perspectives and stories in this sort of community setting. So that sort of ties in, I think, with some of what we wanted to discuss today.
Exactly. I've only heard of this very recently. I was unaware of this concept till very recently. But I believe it's garnered a lot of interest, and especially because it happens to be inclusive, hyper-local, women-led, mostly women from a lot of marginalized communities are getting their voices heard. And I think that's also where the idea of storytelling gains prominence, apart from all of the other very important problems and issues that are being solved, is that a lot of stories that generally don't get told have now a platform to be shared.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. But I think before we sort of like venture deeper into the conversation, I think it'll be useful for listeners to have a framing of what, I know we've said community network a few times now, but how would you possibly define something like that? What is a community network?
A community network is a decentralized grassroots system where people within a specific geographic or interest-based community share information, resources, and support to address local needs. It can be formal or informal and operates across multiple domains like governance, media, health, education, and livelihood. While there are several examples across India on all of these categories, really, for the scope of this conversation, we look at media platforms specifically, only because while all of these are important in terms of civic engagement, media platforms, especially the kind of networks we're talking about, are so essential in meeting some of these civic engagement aspirations that residents and communities also have, it turns out.
Mm-hmm. And I guess it also feels as though I would imagine that these types of networks would naturally form when they feel like there aren't other platforms or other means by which they can access this type of information.
Yes.
So it feels like whatever existing resources are there are clearly insufficient if there's sort of a need to create a more organized sort of platform for the dissemination of some of this information.
Yes. So some of the characteristics of a good community network are that they're locally driven, participatory, and inclusive. They're decentralized, culturally and linguistically relevant. So they're mostly in regional languages of very specific, of a group of villages in a specific area. They also help disseminate important information that's relevant to residents of those locations. And this also includes local practices like folklore, stories that have been in that area generationally. Um, Anything else you'd like to add, Kripa?
Yeah, I was going to say I also quite like the potential to build social capital, right? This idea that we have sort of a shared understanding here of the type of norms that we are ascribing to, and that this how we can sort of work together to uphold some of those norms, to respond to collective challenges, and so it seems like a solid community network would really help build some of that as well.
Yeah. So we've been talking about these networks as media platforms, right? Some well-known examples of these are the Sangam Radio, which is based out of Telangana, which was established in 2008, and it's India's first all-female community radio station that's run entirely by Dalit women. And it's reached about 40 villages.
That's amazing, actually.
Yeah, and serves as a platform for social change. There was a Guardian article on Sangam Radio, and that's how I got to know about them.
I love that they also covered the scope of topics that they were trying to sort of address through the format of their community radio, Really, as I was reading progressively through this article, I was surprised to see how much they talked about. So they had, they wanted to talk about legal issues that would be relevant for their audience, including touching on, securing land rights, how to respond to domestic violence. They used it as like a community announcement center also for if someone had lost any livestock.
Yeah.
But tying a little bit back to what you had shared earlier about the element of storytelling, one of the most one of the most beloved segments, I guess, on the radio show was when there were elderly villagers who would come on as guests and they would narrate, folklore that the community was familiar with, or sometimes not familiar with because it might have been from generations past, or singing of traditional songs. So while there was that, the key elements of good network were very present in this community radio, where they were disseminating, relevant information that the community needed to be informed about. They also simultaneously were doing this work of preserving some of the sort of cultural elements of that particular community.
Right. And it looks like they've also transitioned to digital mediums. They're endeavoring and planning to reach younger city-based audiences.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know that I think a lot of folks who, even now when we've launched into this discussion, and we will be, I think, focusing a lot of our time on radio as one of these, an example of a good community network sort of platform. There is also, I think, a lot of these communities themselves are aware that they cannot be ignorant of the fact that people might not be listening primarily or have access to maybe a radio in the same traditional ways that they did in the past. So exactly, you're right. They're also making this concerted effort to transition to a digital means as well, because they also recognize that, we know that the demographics in villages are changing quite significantly, and there have been trends of, the younger people are migrating out of villages perhaps. And so recognizing that some of their listener base is on the move and migrating towards cities and might have access to, greater disposable income that allows them to purchase things like smartphones, then they have to try, and I think they are making an effort to recognize that this information should still be able to reach members of this community, even if they're far away from the village center. So that is a really cool development as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
There's also other community networks, radio stations that I found out while doing research for this podcast, which is Radio Bundelkhand,
Mm-hmm.
based out of Madhya Pradesh, which is the first community radio station in the state. And happens to be the second in India.
Oh.
They at present reach out to the community of over 2 lakh and in the local language. And they broadcast information and entertainment programs centered on issues of local interest, like updates on weather patterns, sustainable agriculture, and relevant government schemes for the locals there. There's also another platform called Khabar Lahariya in UP and Bihar, which is women-led grassroots news network reporting on issues of local governance, caste, violence, elections, and public schemes. This is something you've also interacted with earlier, no?
Yes, absolutely. So that was also a really interesting sort of organization to talk about, simply because they were also fairly explicit about talking about the struggles of being a women-led community network when a lot of media spaces tend to be ones that are occupied by men primarily.
Mhm.
And so sometimes there are these very relevant community issues that might not feature simply because they might disproportionately affect women. And so when, through the articles that we were reading, KL as this organization this news network
Mhm.
was really trying to make an effort to champion issues that typically, and that's the inclusive element of a good community network, right? Where they think about the folks, their listenership, and think about what could be issues that are not typically covered in mainstream news reporting or mainstream sort of media features,
Yeah. Yeah, it is true that I read some of what they'd been documenting about their journey so far, and they talk about how they've challenged long-held social norms and gender roles by just employing women from that region and surrounding communities as journalists in spaces where journalism is thought of as a male occupation. To have journalists from Dalit, Muslim, tribal communities reporting on issues that are relevant to that local community has been sort of game changing for them. And they continue to train journalists to this day and to employ them in, storytelling and reporting local news.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I mean, I think when some folks might hear citizen journalism, they might think of maybe all the barriers that exist to be able to allow for this type of practice to flourish, right? Because we know that like some of the factors that are required actually to practice perhaps citizen journalism well, like you need, a stable internet connection, you need to have access to, computer, smartphones, and all of these things, and it might only be available to a small segment of the
Yeah.
population. But based on the little bit of reading that I was doing, and particularly I was glancing at, this handbook of digital journalism that says that despite some of these barriers existing, there are many indications that say that citizen journalism is actually beginning to take good root in India, and there is a lot of potential in this particular type of initiative, right? So it's amazing to see like the extent to which sort of there's a fair bit of effort that goes into it. And I know prior to us recording this, Shreya, you and I were discussing even the Khabar KL platform, and just so interesting to see some of their videos on YouTube, right? To be able to see the type of resources that they needed to record some of it, but just the diligence with which it's still being carried out despite some of the limitations. And there seem to be a lot of civil society organizations that are invested in these type of organizations, financially, giving them the resources they need to be able to purchase some of these resources as well. And beyond that, we also know that, I know we're talking about citizen journalism, but if we zoom out ever so slightly and we talk about community radio stations itself,
Yeah.
there is support even from the government where they actually try to create an enabling ecosystem around community radio specifically, right? So that also has opportunity to receive sort of financial support in some way. So it seems like community radio is on the map and here to stay from the looks of it.
Yeah, it's interesting because we always think about citizen journalism, at least in general, that as being something that a lot of large media houses also encourage, and they have a sort of wing that encourages citizen journalism and takes on those stories. I didn't think of this as a completely local. I understand it's also local, but I didn't think of it as hyper local as it is in these instances that we've spoken about, with language being very local to the geography. It's these stories are broadcasted in a lot of the citizen journalism I think encountered have been in English or in Hindi, and so very major in languages that most mass media also sort of publishes in, broadcasts in, to be specific. So in that sense, the fact that these are very local languages, very local stories, has been a new perspective to me, because it's been very urban in my experience. I haven't come across something like this, and I think that's telling of the fact that I haven't interacted with these kinds of radio stations, to be specific.
Yeah, and I think there was something that we were also discussing prior to this around, like, perhaps I think it was communication infrastructure theory. Is that something that you wanted to cover a little bit?
Yes. So I was reading up a little bit of research to understand why, to look at existing research on community networks and civic engagement and how that's beneficial. So according to CIT, I think it's called Community Infrastructure Theory, examines how civic engagement is performed in communities and how storytelling is part of that network. So there is a substantial body of scholarship grounded in this community infrastructure theory that suggests that community storytelling networks connected through news, media, residents, and community organizations function as vital communication assets in promoting civic outcomes, such as higher levels of neighborhood belonging, collective efficacy, and civic participation. And so this is also in line with existing literature on communication and citizenship, demonstrating that communication is essential for democratic decision making processes and outcomes. And so that's in line with promoting a vibrant civic community in civil society. On reading further, I found a framework that talks about the neighborhood storytelling network and how it consists of three agents, which is the micro individual level, which is individual community residents. Two is the meso community level, where two or more additional agents join together. And this includes locally based media, media targeting specific geographic locations and or specific ethnic groups. And then there is the macro community level or mainstream news media, which we're familiar with. What got interest is the fact that at the meso community level, where these networks, community networks, mobilize residents around community issues and broader realm of civic life as applicable to that geography. That sort of resonated in terms of what these radio stations have been doing for so many years now at their own levels of action, right? I found that pretty interesting in terms of, it made sense with the practice also.
And I think if I'm correct in understanding this, when you say storytelling, you're talking about this idea of this very active sort of participation in public discourse. Is that how you're sort of understanding storytelling?
Yes, disseminating information and awareness about important policies or practices relevant to local communities in story form. I think that's how I define it. Of course, storytelling is part of a larger practice of talking about lore, folks, myths, and all of that. And I think that's a big part of, that's definitely a part of some of what these community radio stations also broadcast. But what makes them unique, I think we were discussing earlier, is the fact that, and so compelling is the fact that they share very relevant, pressing issues, cater to that local community, right? One particularly is that it strengthens disaster response and crisis communication. So that's something that's a big part of what these stations broadcast, right? If there is a specific weather related disaster or an emergency or even the pandemic, it has in the past helped residents mobilize resources, access aid, and avoid miscommunication. I think it's also important to note that a lot of the villages that these community network radios are broadcasted in have mid to low levels of literacy. So given that misinformation can be rampant, and I think that's something that these radio networks help solve for. It also helps, build transparency and improve local accountability. Like you mentioned earlier, there have been instances of locals being made aware of their rights, even if it's to land and farmland or rights to water, sanitation, and it's helped mobilize participation in local decision making and governance. So these have been some really sort of groundbreaking and interesting ways of engaging with local communities, residents,
Hmm.
without access to mass media, and more generic stories of distant occurrences. It's very potent in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I can totally see that. But I'm going to be maybe the little bit of the wet blanket here and say, we've covered a lot of ground on all the good. Maybe we should talk a little bit about the bad and the ugly, right? Like, because it does seem like
Yeah.
there seems to be good reason to be able to promote these types of spaces. At the last count, actually, there were about like officially recognized by the government of India is about 500 community radio stations exist, and I have to go into maybe what the scope of definition for community radio might be over there, because I would imagine there's a fair bit of diversity across the board when we're speaking of that. But what would you say maybe some of the roadblocks or challenges that some of these spaces might face if trying to sort of continue to exist, remain relevant? How can they stay sustainable? Like, what's a sustainable way for them to exist?
Right. One of the main things I came across reading was just that not all of these community radio stations can broadcast anything that can be classified as news or current affairs. So that's pretty limiting in that a lot of
Hmm.
issues they respond to or want to talk about is in response to something that's happened, right? So some sort of news, local news or current affairs is almost always involved. And so that's something that they have to very obviously navigate. There is also a new broadcast bill that's in like a proposed draft stage, and that aims to overhaul the regulatory framework for broadcasting services in India. It's still unclear about how this will impact traditional and digital radio platforms like this. But the hope is, I think, for some of these radio stations is that this limitation of not being able to speak about news or current affairs, is lifted in some sense.
Yeah, that's a really valuable point, I think, especially if folks in a community are looking to these stations as a source of relevant information. There is sometimes some sense where it can be curtailed. Although I will say that I think in some radio stations, they end up being sort of a medium by which they can communicate news as understood, such as, like government schemes that are newly launched or things like that can still be communicated as I
Yeah.
understand it. But I hear your point that, sometimes some of the broader coverage on
Yeah.
current affairs might be lost in the midst of it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it also bears to say that where as a society moving towards smartphone usages, and that's still something that a lot of these communities don't have access to, and so are not connected to that network per se. And but there's also the challenge that these radio stations want to also speak to a younger audience who are familiar with local issues and maybe are now sort of working in cities or have moved to cities but want to stay connected. So there is that need to stay relevant and current while also, reach an older group of listeners or readers who are not part of that whole smartphone network and are not sort of very digitally literate in that sense. This is something that all of these platforms are navigating in different levels of success as of now.
I think that's really relevant, because if we're talking about like sustainability of community radio stations, then I think the question of being able to be accessible digitally is also a big one.
Yeah, you were also speaking about IVR earlier and how that's something that these radio stations have to invest in on their end to have like a call-in feature for listeners.
Yeah, so in the article that we were discussing, which came out earlier this year, one of the limitations that this community station identified was the fact that it is expensive to set up something like an interactive voice response system, which allows for a phone call to come in from a listener. They can just dial in a number to tune in to the station using a basic phone. But this would be considered like a slightly more expensive digital upgrade. And when we're speaking of community radio stations, they're typically fairly cash strapped. And so, trying to access funding is sort of a big part of what their efforts are currently going toward. So that can be, yes, a limiting factor.
Yeah, funding also across the board seems to be difficult in terms of continued access to funding, really. The best format for these radio stations has been when they're completely self-reliant, but that's also, I gather, been a challenge in keeping up long term. It's not something they've been able to keep up for a very long period of time. They've always needed access to funding for some upgrade or the other. Although in most cases, these stations have started as a completely self-reliant initiative, as they grow and sort of gain more listeners, funding has been an important part of their journey, it looks like.
Yeah, absolutely.
So most of our conversation today has been around media platforms at hyper local levels of community, right? And that's mostly because they're sustainable. They're a very potent form of citizen journalism, in that they're very easy to access in most cases, at least as of now. And they're also very timely in sharing information. So they seem to have like a really good mix of availability, urgency, ease of access. Of course, it remains to be seen how they're able to navigate a digital environment that going forward. That's also, I think, why we were super interested in this topic as well, right? I mean, they seem to have found a niche that catered to very specific local needs using something that's so, I think, for lack of a better word, basic, like a radio.
Fairly unassuming.
Yeah, very unassuming, really. That's the word. And it's also refreshing because media is also something that's so, I think, bordered. It's also very inaccessible for a normal person to influence narratives or to even really understand, get multiple perspectives on a certain issue, right? There's a certain democratization that's happened with these radio networks, and that's so interesting and refreshing to witness.
Yeah, I'm in complete agreement, and I'm hoping we have the opportunity to go even further in depth to sort of explore how, more of an enabling environment could be created for such structures to exist,
Yeah, exactly. So this was super valuable for me to, I think, find out about some of these platforms, and I hope to follow them in the future and find out more about them. Kripa, it's been amazing discussing this with you. I think we both find this equally relevant, and I hope that it's the case for our readers as well. If you have a chance, please look at Sangam Radio and Khabar Lahariya and Radio Bundelkhand. We'll put all of the links in the show notes there, and we hope you found this useful.
Thank you so much, Shreya.
Thanks, Kripa. See you, folks.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.